It's one of the most exciting psychological thrillers of the West. It's also, I believe, our first novel on this show. I don't think we've talked about novels before. The old woman was bareheaded, as always. Her light-colored hair, sparse and with gray patches, smeared generously with grease, as usual, was braided into a thin pigtail tucked under a comb of horn that stuck out at the nape of her neck. As a result of her small size, the blow came down on the crown of her head. She cried out, but very weakly, and suddenly collapsed completely onto the floor, although she'd managed to raise both hands to her head. In one, she kept hold of the pledge. Then he struck her a second time, and a third, with all his might, still using the butt of the axe and hitting her crown. Blood gushed forth as if from an overturned glass, and her body tumbled backward. He stepped away, let her fall, and then bent down to peer into her face. She was already dead. Her eyes were wide open, as if they wanted to jump out, and her forehead and entire face were wrinkled and distorted by a spasm. That is a passage from very early on in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. It's been said that this is a murder mystery in which the question is not who done it, but why he done it, and most importantly, whether he's going to confess. It's one of the most exciting psychological thrillers of the West. It's also, I believe, our first novel on this show. I don't think we've talked about novels before, but they're obviously a huge part of Western literature. Some sort of trace them back to Don Quixote, to the famous, lengthy tome of Cervantes, which we will cover in another episode. But this is shorter, it's more manageable. It's incredibly exciting, I think, as you heard from that passage, but it is also a profound novel of philosophy and psychology, a character study, an examination of how philosophical ideas play out in practice, which, as you know, is something I am very interested in on this show. I think we all should be interested in what the implications are in real life of our ideas about philosophy. And I am going to be arguing today that this novel is a demonstration of why you can't wish the moral universe away. I have sort of hit on this theme a couple times in the show. When we talked about Macbeth, I talked about how Macbeth murdering the king kind of just comes back. The whole universe basically bends back toward him to bury him and his wife in that guilt. And then I talked in Paradise Lost about how Satan imagines that he can just, by sheer force of will, by making himself believe that heaven is hell and hell is heaven, he can be blissful in hell. And that proves, of course, to be the opposite of the case, that hell basically all turns inward on Satan and makes his experience miserable, no matter where he goes, whether he goes to Earth or anywhere else. This is a much grittier novel than Paradise Lost is a poem. It emerges out of very different social circumstances. And so I'm going to, first of all, just talk about Dostoevsky, his life, and what was going on in Russia at the time that he wrote this. This came out in 1866, serially, in 12 monthly installments in the Russian Messenger. So let's talk a little bit about what was going on in Russia during that time and what was going on in Dostoevsky's life that kind of helps us understand what this novel is about. Just pause and bring you a word from our sponsor, Ancient Language Institute. This is the time to sign up. You can start learning Latin or Ancient Greek this summer. I think that Ancient Language Institute is so cool because what they do is they kind of minimize the grammar drills and the vocab memorization that usually goes along with ancient language learning, and they focus on develop reading skills as soon as possible. I have spoken a lot about how valuable it is to get this, deep encounter with these texts we love. They focus on fluency and comprehension so that you'll be able to read people like Virgil, Aristotle, the New Testament. They do Koine Greek, which is really particularly cool. And you can read them in just a few semesters of study. Go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics to get started, and you get 15% off when you use the offer code Heretics, Heretics. TICS, just like in the title of the show. The summer semester is open only for another couple of weeks, so sign up quickly. The spots fill up really quickly. They take students of all ages, all experience levels, so all you have to do, you reach out to them. They'll give you a personal consultation, find the right class for you, but do it quick. Go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, offer code heretics for 15% off. Okay, back to the show. I am reading here from a translation by Michael R. Katz. I really love this translation. It's got a nice, succinct introduction, which I'm going to read from now, and the translation itself is very compelling, powerful. I mean, this is emotionally just devastating novel, I think. So it's good to have a translation that gets at the nuances of some of the slang in it and all of that. Here's Katz on the historical context of Crime and Punishment. The decade of the 1860s was one of the most turbulent in Russian history. Russia's ignominious defeat in the Crimean War had exposed the deficiencies of the autocracy. The accession of Alexander II to the throne in 1855 promised significant changes. This is the Tsar, the new Tsar. His reign is known as the Era of Great Reforms. Organs for local self-government, zemstvos, were established to deal with local economic needs. Judicial reforms were instituted to promote the speedy and equitable administration of justice, and military reforms were enacted to modernize the Russian army. The greatest and best known of Alexander's great reforms was, of course, the long-awaited emancipation of the serfs in 1861, 2 years before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves. This is a radical transformation of Russian society out of a kind of late feudalism, where you have these serfs who are working the land for masters, into modernity. It's like snapping your finger and suddenly all of the problems and all of the blessings of modernity come sweeping in. So Katz goes on. Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment was first published in the literary journal The Russian Messenger, as I mentioned, in 12 monthly installments during 1866, in the middle of this turbulent decade. The novel reflects the social upheaval and the major changes in Russian society after centuries of serfdom. With growing migration to the cities, poverty became a constant hardship for new urban dwellers. There was an increase in violence as a result of difficult economic conditions. The murder rate arose, and the Russian press reported on horrendous crimes in graphic detail: drunkenness, prostitution, disease, unemployment, family breakups, and abandoned children all came to typify the nature of Russian reality in the 1860s. And that is very much the world of this book. It takes place in St. Petersburg, which is the capital of Russia. It was supposed to be the Peter the Great's, another Tsar, Peter the Great's window onto the West. That is the city where Russia would face westward toward Europe and would modernize, would kind of, receive, again, these blessings of modernity. We have talked about this before in America, that when there is something, just because something is just doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and doesn't mean that all the effects of it are going to be good. In America, when we freed the slaves, there were a bunch of social complications and serious economic hardships, questions about what was to be done with these newly freed slaves, how they would be able to make it in their free life. This is, analogous to what's going on here, this shock to the system that Russia is suffering. And, with all of these people flooding into the cities, you get crime. It's hot. It's always hot in the novel. I will just read the first passage of the novel to give you a sense of the kind of cloying atmosphere that the main character, whose name is Raskolnikov, moves through. This is chapter 1. In the beginning of July, during an extremely hot spell toward evening, a young man left his tiny room, which he sublet from some tenants who lived in Stolyarny Lane, stepped out onto the street and slowly, as if indecisively, set off towards the Kokushkin Bridge. He had successfully managed to avoid meeting his landlady on the staircase. His small room, more like a closet than an apartment, was tucked under the roof of a tall 5-story building. The landlady of the apartment, who rented him this room and provided both dinner and a servant, lived below in a separate apartment on the same staircase. Every time he left to go out, he had to pass the landlady's kitchen door, which was almost always left open onto the landing. Every time the young man passed, he felt a painful and fearful sensation, one that he was ashamed of and that made him wince. He was deeply in debt to the landlady and was afraid to face her. And that creeping sense of claustrophobia is how the novel begins. The first section of it is this, sort of intense back and forth within Raskolnikov's mind. Brief pause here to bring you a word from our sponsors at Young America's Foundation. I have been talking a lot on this show about the threats to American liberty, about censorship from big tech, about the just insanely, radically, relentlessly biased media, the professors who teach garbage to your kids in high school and before it, and at the end as well as the universities, right? All of this stuff, none of it happened overnight. It's part of a long plan that the left has been implementing for, half a century more, really. It is time for us to fight back in kind. It is time to fight for America's future. And the guy who is doing it is Scott Walker. He was the governor of Wisconsin, where he stood up against all the dirty tricks of the left. He stood firm. He won the day. He is the new president now of Young America's Foundation, and he is launching what is called Long Game. This is a plan for winning the battle and the war in the long term. You can get a playbook for the long game at yaf.org/long game. You have a free copy of this bold plan to save America and find out how you can get involved. Really cool. So go ahead and check it out at yaf.org/long game. Okay, back to the show. Let's talk a little bit about philosophically what was going on in Dostoevsky's own life and also in St. Petersburg, where he lived for quite some time in the same city that this novel is set in, St. Petersburg. And in the 1840s and onward, and a little bit before as well, there were these ideas floating around about what to do about this society in which economic inequality was rampant before and after the liberation of the serfs. And the question is basically, how should we organize our society? How should we live together? Dostoevsky was not of ignoble birth. He was nobility in the sense of his birth, but his family was not wealthy. And his father, Dostoevsky's father, was a doctor at Moscow's Hospital for the Poor. So he saw poverty firsthand. He was surrounded by the lowest of the low in this Russian society. And he essentially, as he moved into St. Petersburg from Moscow, so he started out, he studied at like a military engineering academy, but that was obviously not his calling. And he ends up in the St. Petersburg literary scene, which at the time is bandying around all of these sort of utilitarian and socialist ideas, right? It's this utopian notion that we are going to move in Russia from this extreme inequality to a reconciliation between the classes. And one of the ideas on the table was we were going to do this, as it were, bypassing capitalism. So we'll go from this terrible situation, and we will not go through the sort of capitalist period that, according to the Marxist narrative, right, the societies are sort of go through these periods of capitalism before the great liberation, the socialist utopia that comes in. Dostoevsky is in these circles. He's talking about these ideas. He seems to be buying into them, and he became involved in particular with a circle of intellectuals that were immersed in French utopian socialist thought. So this idea that that we are going essentially to usher in this grand new age. They would get together. They would talk about Russia's future, what was going to go on, how they should participate. It's led by this guy Mikhail Petrashevsky. So he's sort of in these circles. He's in his 20s. He ends up committing what was at the time a crime, which was reading a particular letter. It was outlawed to read in a public gathering an open letter from the literary critic Vissarion Belinsky to Nikolai Gogol, criticizing these views of Gogol's that he found reaction. So I'm going to read a portion of the letter that got Dostoevsky arrested, as a way of explaining the kind of ideas that before he wrote this novel, he sort of had in his mind, he was surrounded by. He says, this is Belinsky, and this is the letter that Dostoevsky read aloud. In 1847, he wrote, You, to Gogol, as far as I can see, do not properly understand the Russian public. Its character is determined by the condition of Russian society in which fresh forces are seething and struggling for expression. But weighed down by heavy oppression and finding no outlet, they induce merely dejection, weariness, and apathy. Only literature, despite the Tartar censorship, shows signs of life and progressive movement. That is why the title of writer is held in such esteem among us. That is why literary success is easy among us, even for a writer of little talent. The title of poet and writer has long since eclipsed the tinsel of epaulets and gaudy uniforms. So this is, you can see these kind of delusions of grandeur, these incredibly high floating ideas that were going around at the time. And they were basically, centered on this. When I say utilitarian ideas, what I mean is this idea that essentially outcomes are the way to judge things morally. What you do is good or bad depending on the outcomes that it produces. And so you can see why Raskolnikov, the main character of this novel, is basically reflecting that philosophy. I mean, one of the wonderful things about Dostoevsky's novels is that each character basically embodies certain ideas that were urgent at the time. And this utilitarian idea, well, if I kill this woman, she'll be dead. So you might say, traditionally speaking, in traditional morality, that's bad. But in utilitarian morality, wouldn't everybody be better off? Wouldn't even maybe she would be better off? She's miserable. She's this ugly old hag. And essentially, Raskolnikov is reflecting this idea that, well, if we can redistribute wealth, right? If I can take her money and get other people out of poverty, if I can remove this obstacle to so many people's happiness and flourishing, shouldn't I do it, right? This is the greatest good for the greatest number. Even if it is bad for her, it's good for so many other people. And so you can tell, right, that eventually Dostoevsky must have moved past this idea because he's representing it leading, as it naturally would, to a murder. There is no reason in utilitarian philosophy why you shouldn't kill this person, because it would produce the greatest good for the greatest number. And so he dramatizes, first of all, Raskolnikov kind of running through these possibilities and these ideas in his head. And so there's a scene, this is a big novel, so obviously I'm going to pick portions from it, and you should go and read it if you find this interesting. There's a scene in this kind of shabby tavern. Everything takes place. Raskolnikov is a destitute student. His friends are destitute students. Everything takes place in these kind of like grungy parts of town. And he overhears at a tavern a conversation between a military officer and another student. So they're talking about the woman that Raskolnikov will eventually end up killing, Alyona Ivanovna. These Russian names can be tough, especially because people get called different things at different times by different people. You'll get used to it as you go along. So they're talking about the old woman, the pawnbroker that Raskolnikov will kill, and her half-sister, Lizaveta Ivanovna. But this is basically the argument that the student and the officer are having is mirroring the idea that's going on in Raskolnikov's head. And the student says, "Here's what I can tell you. I can kill and rob that cursed old woman, and can assure you, feel no pangs of conscience," the student added passionately. The officer burst out laughing once again, but Raskolnikov shuddered. This was so strange. "Allow me to pose a serious question to you," the student said, growing excited. "I was joking just now, of course, but look, on the one hand, here's a stupid, mindless, worthless, spiteful, sick old hag, needed by no one. On the contrary, causing harm to everyone. She herself doesn't know what she's living for, and she'll die of her own accord tomorrow. Do you understand? Do you?" "Well, I do," replied the officer, staring attentively at his impassioned comrade. "Listen further. On the other hand, there are young, fresh forces going to waste for lack of support." You hear the similarities, the echoes of that open letter, right? Young, fresh forces bursting forward, except they're being suppressed by evil people like this old woman. Going to waste for lack of support by the thousands all over the place. 100, even 1,000 good deeds and undertakings could be planned and performed with the old woman's money that's being left in her will to a monastery. Hundreds, maybe thousands of beings could be set on the right path. Dozens of families could be rescued from poverty, kept from dissolution, from ruin, debauchery, and venereal hospitals. All this with her wealth. Murder her and take her money and then use it to dedicate yourself to the service of all humanity and to the common good. What do you think? Wouldn't thousands of good deeds make up for one little tiny crime? thousands of lives saved from rack and ruin for one life, one death, and 100 lives in exchange. It's a matter of arithmetic. What's the life of that consumptive, stupid, spiteful old woman worth on the common scale? No more than that of a louse, a cockroach. Not even that much, because the old woman's harmful. She consumes other people's lives. Just the other day, she bit Lizaveta's finger out of spite. They almost had to amputate. So the question here, right, is what's the argument against that student? And basically, Dostoevsky is showing that within utilitarian, the kind of socialist utilitarian philosophy that was going around in St. Petersburg and in Russia at the time, in that utilitarian philosophy, there is no argument against killing this old pawnbroker woman. There's another novel, What is to be Done, which came out in 1832 by Nikolai Chernyavsky. And some of the same ideas come up in this. This was Lenin's favorite novel. This kind of rational egoism that, if I can calculate the good that will be done by this thing, which would, in itself maybe be bad, be a crime, then I can justify doing it. And this, this is also related, of course, to the utilitarianism that's going around in England, right? And Dostoevsky saying, what is the argument against this within utilitarianism? Because it's obviously a crime, it's obviously an atrocity, and we can tell in the murder how bad it is. So the next thing that Dostoevsky does brilliantly is he confronts us with the actual scene of the murder, in which he ends up killing both Lizaveta and the pawnbroker. And this is like, we can't look at that scene and not see the horror of it, see the gore of it. Raskolnikov himself is deeply affected and so anxious afterward that he doesn't even manage to get all of the money that he came there ostensibly to get. Let me read the aftermath of the scene now that I read at the beginning after he's killed the old woman. So he sort of roots around, tries to get the money, makes a total mess of it. And then suddenly, he heard someone moving in the room where the old woman's body lay. He paused and fell silent as a corpse. But everything was quiet. Of course, he must have only imagined it. All of a sudden, he heard a feeble cry, as if someone was emitting quiet and intermittent moans, which then subsided. Deadly silence prevailed again for a minute or two. He was squatting down next to the chest and waiting, hardly drawing a breath. But suddenly he jumped up, grabbed the axe, and ran out of the bedroom. In the middle of the room stood Lizaveta, holding a large bundle. She was staring in a stupor at her murdered sister, looking white as a sheet, as if lacking the strength to scream. Seeing him come running out of the bedroom, she began trembling like a leaf, a gentle trembling, and shudders ran across her entire face. She raised one arm, was about to open her mouth, but still didn't cry out. She began slowly backing away from him into the corner, eyes fixed on him, but still not screaming, as if she didn't have enough breath to scream. He rushed at her with the axe. Her lips became so desperately distorted, just like those of little children when they begin to feel frightened of someone, staring at the thing that frightens them, getting ready to cry. This unfortunate Lizaveta was so simple, so helpless, and so terrified once and for all that she didn't even raise her arms to protect her face, although that would have been the most necessary and natural gesture at that moment, because the axe was raised right above her face. She merely lifted her free left arm ever so slightly, nowhere near her face, and slowly extended it toward him, as if pushing him away. The blow struck her right on the skull with the blade of the axe and immediately hacked through the entire upper part of her forehead, almost to her crown. She collapsed onto the floor at once. Raskolnikov was about to panic. He grabbed her bundle, threw it down again, and ran into the entranceway. This piteous, heartrending, and gruesome scene, which displays, this is what art only can do, right? No moral philosophy, no argument based in syllogisms can place before you the emotional reality of what murder is. And now, of course, he hasn't just murdered this awful, mean old woman. He's murdered her simple, sort of lovable half-sister. And the piteous, childish way that she tries ineffectively to defend herself just tears your heart open and will haunt Raskolnikov for the rest of the novel. That's on this edition, this is page 88 that I just read. The novel goes up, it's 600 pages long. So this happens very, very early on. And that's why I say it's not actually a whodunit. We know whodunit. We know what he done. And the question is, right, what's going to happen to him spiritually, morally, psychologically now. You can tell that where I'm going with this is not like everything is hunky-dory, great, utilitarianism is awesome, we love it, right? But how did Dostoevsky get there? So when we last left him, remember he had been arrested for reading aloud this letter within the kind of, utilitarian, utopian circle that he was in. He was arrested. He was sentenced to death. And so obviously this was a harrowing and life-changing experience for him. At the last minute, his sentence was commuted. So they lined him up. They were going to shoot him, and suddenly a messenger arrives with a rescue from the Tsar. Now this was quite possibly a stunt. This was maybe a mock execution, because officially, at least, the death sentence was actually not permitted in Russia anyway. And so probably this was all planned out from the beginning. But a fat lot of good that did Dostoevsky, who had in his own experience come within an inch of his life. Instead, he's sentenced to exile, essentially. And for 4 years in Omsk, which is in Siberia, he does hard labor in military prison alongside common criminals. So he is, now thrown in once again, shoulder to shoulder with the lowest of the low. People who have, some of them, committed awful crimes, not just reading a letter aloud, right? And on the one hand, he says he's, never alone. He's surrounded by people. On the other hand, he's incredibly lonely. He's not allowed any books. He only gets a gospel, a New Testament Bible, which he thumbed through. And this is one of the most moving things. You can still see the Bible that he got, with the thumb marks on it. Obviously, this was his sustenance, his whole life in this time. It transformed his entire outlook, as of course it would, right? To be suddenly confronted with the realities of life after you've been, swanning around with your literary friends in St. Petersburg, talking about how we're going to all live in a socialist utopia. The first thing, interestingly, that he seems to have learned in this time is that the actual common people are living on like a totally different plane. There's all of these like intellectuals are talking about, the workers are going to rise up. They're going to be our salvation. And in fact, the workers are, he says, some of them deeply religious, sincerely religious. He was very moved by what he saw, especially, among these people who had committed terrible crimes, their belief in the merciful saving God of the gospel. And this totally reworked his idea, right? Because notice the scorn with which the utilitarians talk about donating money to a monastery, right? In this book, that's pointed, this idea that like these socialists think they've moved beyond all this, but the workers haven't, the people haven't. This is what sustains them in their times of trial and need, and what sustains him in his imprisonment. At the same time, and this is, before he even goes to prison, in 1849, he writes to his brother before his exile. He says, "Brother, my precious friend, all is settled. I am sentenced to 4 years hard labor in the fortress, and after that to serve as a private. Today, the 22nd of December, we were taken to the Semyonov drill ground. There, the sentence of death was read to all of us. We were told to kiss the cross. Our swords were broken over our heads, and our last toilet was made, white shirts. Then 3 were tied to the pillar for execution. I was the 6th. 3 at a time were called out. Consequently, I was in the second batch, and no more than a minute was left me to live. I remembered you, brother, and all yours. During the last minute, you alone were in my mind. Only then I realized how I love you, dear brother mine. Finally, the retreat was sounded, and those tied to the pillar were led back, and it was announced to us that His Imperial Majesty granted us our lives. I have not become downhearted or low-spirited. Life is everywhere life in ourselves, not what is outside us. There will be people near me, and to be a man among people and remain a man forever, not to be downhearted, nor to fall in whatever misfortunes may befall me. This is life. This is the task of life." Before we go on, just a brief mention of locals. I wanted to remind you about this new platform. The community on there is growing so quickly. It is so cool to see all these folks who watch and listen to the show and who are here to support it and to engage with the ideas of the West more deeply. You can become a Young Heretics VIP by going to youngheretics.com/ Locals. And truly, I recommend that you do, because I would love to have you on there and to, talk to you more regularly about how the show is affecting you, how you're implementing. A lot of the times we talk about how we're implementing the ideas of the show in our own lives. So it's really a community of support and growth. It helps us, I think, to take this thing to the next level, and you can help support the show. You get a bunch of extra stuff when you become a VIP. So you get episodes a week in advance without ads. So you get get to watch them before everyone else does. And then people ask all sorts of questions, both in sort of, on the message board, but also in live stream Q&As. We did one of those just recently. We'll do another one soon. Those are really fun for me because I get to directly engage with you, as I do also on the video mailbag, which you have to be a VIP to be a part of. Plus, I write stuff that goes deeper. I write articles that go deeper into the themes of some of the episodes, which you can only find also on Locals. So go to youngheretics.com/locals, and you can help support the show and go deeper into the stuff that we do here. Okay, hope to see you there. Now back to this episode. So this is a man who has had an epiphany, a revelation, right? I mean, people talk about how he transformed his outlook in prison, and surely that's true in all the ways that I've just said. But ultimately, what he's coming face to face with here is the inestimable, the incalculable value of simple human life, of every human life. And that is the argument that he has against the utilitarians, why you should not murder, why thou shalt not kill, right? He has realized that commandment, the absoluteness of that commandment, is based in the infinitude of human worth. And this is something, of course, that we today, right, are completely at odds with, that we are, we have what is our argument against utilitarianism, right? We want to be nice, good people, but then you get these arguments, right? Well, you should be able to execute a baby in the womb, right? You should be able to kill, because look at all the good it'll do. Look at how the mother will have a better life. Look at how, this baby would probably live a miserable life in poverty. And so it's okay. It's okay to do this thing. What's our argument against that? Our argument against it is that every human life is inestimably sacred, full stop. And that's what Dostoevsky knew from the reality of the firing line, right? From the reality of coming up against the potential of execution. Suddenly he experienced in his own self what his life was worth. And he could never again imagine that anybody else's life would be expendable on behalf of some, crackpot utopian theory. And so that is how this novel works out eventually, right? Is that the truth of that, the inescapable moral reality of that comes back and just hunts Raskolnikov down. It hunts him down in the person, really, of two characters. I'll mention in passing that there are a lot of characters in this novel. One of them that's kind of interesting is Svidrigailov, who is this kind of gentleman of questionable past, and he's sort of the Epicurean. He just whatever he does good and bad, no matter what. It just gives him pleasure. And Dostoevsky shows him basically devolving into meaningless, eventually committing suicide. But Raskolnikov is watching Svidrigailov and how untroubled he seems, because he seems externally to have jettisoned the moral universe, and he just doesn't care. Whereas Raskolnikov is tormented by this one act, right? He can't get over it. By having Svidrigailov commit suicide, right? Dostoevsky is saying that same thing again, that you look at other people and you think, oh, they are without remorse. Oh, they've transcended. Oh, they've gone beyond the moral universe. But you're only told your own story, right? You only understand what's going on in your own heart. And you don't know until the moment of decision, right, whether somebody else is actually tormented or suffering the consequences of amorality or immorality in another way. And so we get the inner life of Raskolnikov, and we see what this does to him psychologically. There are two crucial characters who basically draw this out of Raskolnikov. The first is the detective, Porfiry Petrovich, who's assigned to investigate this murder, right? Because, of course, it's discovered that these two women have been killed. And basically, as Raskolnikov is being, he flies into a fever, and he's drawn back again and again to Petrovich, who is essentially performing a very sophisticated form of psychological torture on Raskolnikov to get him to confess. Petrovich knows, he suspects, he has this, this hunch that Raskolnikov did it, and he is trying to draw him out by tormenting him morally. So let's just read one of those scenes. So he's talking, this is Petrovich talking to Raskolnikov. Regarding all these questions, crimes, environments, and young girls, I now remember, however, it's always interested me, your little article on crime, or whatever it's called. I forgot the title, I can't remember it. 2 months ago, I had the pleasure of reading it in Periodical Discourses. Raskolnikov says, my article in Periodical Discourses? Raskolnikov asked in surprise. I did write an article in connection with some book about 6 months ago when I left the university, but I sent it to Weekly Discourses, not Periodical Discourses. Well, it wound up in Periodical Discourses. Weekly Discourses ceased publication, which is why it wasn't published there. That's true, sir. When it ceased publication, Weekly Discourses merged with Periodical Discourses, and therefore your little article appeared in Periodical Discourses 2 months ago. Didn't you know? Raskolnikov really didn't know a thing about it. Good gracious, you can request money from them for your article. But what a temperament you have. You live in such an isolated life that you don't even know things that concern you directly. That's a fact, sir. Bravo, Rodka. Rodka is Raskolnikov, right? Bravo, Rodka. I didn't know it either, cried Razumikhin. I'll run to the reading room today and ask for that issue. 2 months ago? What date? I'll find it somehow. That's quite something. And he didn't even tell me. You get the sense of the kind of like, happy, bumbling friend, irrepressible, sort of naive, like best buddy, right? How did you know that it was my article? I signed it only with my initials. I found out accidentally, and only a few days ago, from the editor. He's an acquaintance. I was very interested in it. I was examining, if I recall, the psychological state of the criminal during the entire commission of his crime. Yes, says the detective, and you insisted that the act of committing a crime is always accompanied by illness. It's very, very original, but it wasn't that part of your little piece that caught my eye. Rather, it was the idea mentioned at the end of the article, which, unfortunately, you merely touch on by implication, that there exist in the world certain people, as it were, who are able, that is, not that they're able, but who have every right to commit any kind of outrages and crimes, and that the laws do not apply to them. Raskolnikov smiled at the forced and intentional distortion of his idea. What? What's that? A right to crime? And not because the environment ruined them? Razumikhin inquired with some alarm. No, that's not exactly why, replied Porfiry. The point is that in his article, all people are divided into ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary people must live in obedience and do not have the right to overstep the law because, don't you see, they're ordinary. But extraordinary people have the right to commit all sorts of crimes and to overstep precisely because they're extraordinary. That's what you say, it seems, if I'm not mistaken. So you see, he lays the trap. Porfiry lays the trap. And then suddenly it springs. They're talking about this article. Oh, when it came out here and there, right? Razumikhin is like kind of oblivious, talking about like, oh, I'll go get a copy. And then suddenly he says, oh, but you said in that article exactly what we've been talking about, which is that certain people are above and beyond the moral universe, isn't that right? And this is indeed exactly what Raskolnikov has been trying to prove to himself that he is, that he has the wherewithal, the kind of Napoleonic greatness. Remember, Napoleon was a big figure for Russia in this time. Kind of Napoleonic greatness to transcend the moral law and simply to do this thing for the good of all humanity and get over the sort of illness and whatever that usually accompanies such things. Now, of course, Raskolnikov has seen in himself that he did not escape the torment, the emotional torment that comes with evil and with wrongdoing, because he himself has fallen ill. He's had this terrible suffering. He's delirious with guilt, but he's in this cat and mouse game with Petrovich. Meanwhile, and this is really the emotional core, the sort of representative of all that is good and pure, Sofia Semyonovna Marladova, usually just sort of referred to as Sonia. And Sonia has basically been forced into prostitution because her father, Marmeladov, is a drunkard, and squandered all of his money, so she had to become a prostitute. And he basically becomes wrapped up, Raskolnikov becomes wrapped up in this family. He meets Sonia one time while he's tending her father after an ultimately fatal carriage accident. So that's the first time that they encounter each other. Then she comes back to him, and this is the beginning of the real crisis relationship of the novel. So let me just read her return. At that moment, the door opened quietly and a young woman entered the room, glancing around timidly. Everyone turned to her with astonishment and curiosity. Raskolnikov didn't recognize her at first. It was Sofia Semyonovna Marmeladova. He had seen her yesterday for the first time, but at such a moment, in such circumstances, and in such clothes, that he remembered an entirely different face. Now she was a modestly, even poorly dressed young woman, very young indeed, almost like a girl, with modest, proper manners and an innocent but seemingly frightened face. She was wearing a very simple everyday dress and an old, outmoded hat on her head, but she was carrying a parasol in her hands, and as she had yesterday. Unexpectedly, seeing a room full of people, she wasn't merely embarrassed, but overwhelmed. She felt timid as a child, and even made a move to leave. She's this just ray of light. And people have said, in the history of the reception of this novel, people have said that Sonia is what you might call a Mary Sue, in the sense, basically, that she's just too good to be true. She's this pure, innocent creature, but she's also a prostitute, right? Because she has to be, right? I think this is a severe misreading of the novel. I think that Dostoevsky means for us to understand that the poverty with which these people grapple is real, that it's not as if, the reason that utilitarianism, the reason that socialism was so attractive to people like Dostoevsky in his early life is because it was a response to a real problem. It was not as if everything was just hunky-dory, right? There really was just this awful just social crack-up going on in St. Petersburg and in Russia more generally, that was forcing people into these desperate situations. And what he's insisting with Sonia is that people in those desperate situations don't have to go down dark roads the way that Raskolnikov does. And he insists this kind of with Rachumitkin too, that in order to claim, as socialists kind of do, that everything is determined by social class, right? In order to claim that, you have to imagine that people like Sonia don't exist. But they do, right? These people who maintain their dignity, who insist upon their innocence, who are just paragons of virtue, even within these horrible circumstances, right? And so Dostoevsky really does, make it clear to us that Sonia is a prostitute. It's not as if we can't, imagine that she would ever do such a thing. It's just that it's a Christian vision of, right, the prostitutes and sinners enter the kingdom of heaven before you, as Jesus says to the religious leaders, right? Sonia is this kind of beacon of hope, of kind of tragic Christian hope, as compared to the utopian, essentially just fantasy that Raskolnikov is kind of spiraling into as he struggles with this murder. What's remarkable here, and I've said before when we talked about T.S. Eliot, I mentioned this Eliot quote that the great poet in writing himself writes his time. Dostoevsky is painting an extremely precise portrait of these individual human beings in relationship with one another that's based in large part on his own trauma, his own experience, the author's own life journey, and journey really to deepening of faith. And yet he is tapping into something essential about what was happening to the West at the time that is still happening to us. And that essential thing is essentially the loss of God, the loss of belief in God, that when you take absolute morality, when you take the absolute God-given right of every human being to live out of the equation, it seems as if everything is going to work, as if suddenly the whole thing is going to click into place and now the machine will work without God. But instead, it grinds hideously into atrocity and disaster. And that would be what would happen. It was prophetic, right? Because that would happen throughout the early 20th century, these hideous forms of authoritarianism and mass murder that would eventually arise, right? All of these things are traceable to this sort of newfound notion that, if we do away with these absolute divine mandates, then the Übermensch can arise. And as I'm talking, maybe you are thinking, right, this is Nietzsche. What's remarkable, and Nietzsche is this German philosopher, right, who is the central philosopher really of the death of God, and the Übermensch idea that Raskolnikov kind of has, that he can transcend morality and just do as he wishes, for the good of all, or not even for the good of all so much as just because he can, because he is great, right? That's, really textbook Friedrich Nietzsche. But Dostoevsky, as far as we know, never read Nietzsche. He was just foreseeing it in the ideas that were already there at the time. He saw it coming. He foresaw basically these two men, right, are basically grappling the same problem. Dostoevsky is seeing it in St. Petersburg. Nietzsche is seeing it in German society. And And basically they're giving diametrically opposed answers. Dostoevsky is insisting upon the irreducible value of human life as God-given. And Nietzsche basically is saying, let the Übermensch be free, right? And we know how that worked out. But Nietzsche himself, in the Twilight of Idols, mentioned, it says Dostoevsky. So Nietzsche read Dostoevsky, even though Dostoevsky didn't read Nietzsche, right? And Nietzsche mentioned in Twilight of the Idols, right, that Dostoevsky is the only psychologist from whom I had something to learn, and that discovering Dostoevsky ranks among the most beautiful strokes of fortune in my life. Now, we'll talk about Nietzsche another day on another episode. But I just wanted to point this out, right? That this truly is the prophetic power of artists, that they can tap into these things. And that Dostoevsky had an answer to it that was not based on atheism, right? That was based on insisting that people like Sonia could exist. If you are listening to my voice and you are enjoying it, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe. I'm so grateful that you're here. This show is such bliss for me to do. We're coming up on our 50th episode. This is our 49th episode. If you want to support us, there's a bunch of ways you can do it. First of all, subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can do that anywhere you get your podcasts. You can get it on iTunes, Google, Stitcher. YouTube is another great place to do it. And then please do leave us a 5-star review. That really helps on iTunes. If you leave a 5-star review and tell your friends about it, tweet about it, tweet at me about it, however you want to recommend us, but just, do subscribe so that we can keep this show going, and leave us a 5-star review if you really want to help support us. Okay, back to the show. Let us read one more. I don't totally want to spoil this novel. I always find it annoying when people spoil the ending of classic works, and sometimes you kind of have to talk about them. But let's read a conversation near the end between Sonia and Raskolnikov, and then I will leave you to go and read the rest of the novel to find out what happens afterward. So Raskolnikov confesses to Sonia. So Sonia now knows, and the question is he going to confess to the detective, to Porfiry? And here's the kind of conversation that they have. He says, "I merely killed a louse, Sonia, a useless, vile, pernicious louse." She says, "That louse was a human being." "Even I know she wasn't a louse," he replied, looking at her strangely. "But I'm lying, Sonia," he added. "I've been lying for a long time. This isn't right at all. You're telling the truth. There are other reasons, completely different reasons. I haven't talked to anyone for a long time, Sonia. My head aches very badly now." His eyes burned with a feverish fire. He was almost beginning to rave. An anxious smile wandered across his lips. A terrible weakness showed through his agitated state of mind. Sonia understood that he was tormented. Her head also began spinning, and he was speaking so strangely, as if it were coherent. But how? How could it be? "Oh, Lord!" She wrung her hands in despair. "No, Sonia, that's not it," he began again, suddenly raising his head as if struck and aroused again by an unexpected turn of thought. "That's not it. It would be better to suppose, yes, that really would be better, to suppose that I'm proud, envious, wicked, loathsome, vengeful, and perhaps even disposed to madness. Let it all come out in one clean sweep. People mentioned madness before, I noticed. I told you previously that I wasn't able to support myself at the university. Do you know that I might even have been able to do so? My mother would have sent money for the required fees, and I could have earned enough for boots, clothes, and bread. Most likely, there were lessons to give. I was offered half a ruble for each. Rajumishin's working, but I turned spiteful and didn't want to do it." Turned spiteful, precisely. That's a good phrase. Then, like a spider, I took refuge in my corner. So it's all coming out, right? That as I said, right, Rajumishin is basically the foil to this because he's working. So it's not actually necessity that drove you to this. And then, he goes on like this for a while, and then, here's Sonia, right? "Oh, stop it. Be quiet," Sonia cried, clasping her hands. "You've strayed from God, and God has struck you and given you over to the devil." By the way, Sonia, when I was lying there in the darkness and imagining all these things, was that the devil who was misleading me? Huh? "Stop it," she says. "Don't make fun, you blasphemer. You don't understand a thing. Not one thing. Oh, Lord, he won't understand anything. Not one thing." So you see this, it's this encounter between these incredibly tortured arabesque turns of logic, right? That, oh yes, I did it because of this. Oh no, for this other reason, right? And this mockery of morality up against just the simple fact of his crime. And Sonia saying, "You have strayed from God." And of course, she is ready to forgive, right? But she believes that this act comes with consequences, that what he must do is basically purify himself by serving whatever sentence the law gives. I am going to leave it an open question for you whether Raskolnikov ultimately does confess. I think that if you want to know, you should go and read the book. But I just wanted to set that up for you as one of the great dramatic tensions in really all of Western literature, certainly in the history of the Western novel, and a perfect prediction of all of our own predicament, right? Of what happens, well, if I just get rid of God, everything works. Except, of course, it doesn't. And this is a wonderful novel for grappling with the ways in which it doesn't. All right. Thanks for joining me. Hope you liked this episode. Let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me through Locals. If you are not on Locals, you can join right now by going to youngheretics.com/locals. It's an incredible platform. When you become a Young Heretics VIP and join the Young Heretics community, you get all sorts of extra benefits, like you get the episodes a week in advance without ads. You can participate in live Q&As and other live streams, and you can ask mailbag questions, including video mailbag questions if you want to be featured on the show, asking the question yourself, which is really cool. It's an amazing platform run by my pal Dave Rubin, and therefore like so much better than the big tech platforms, which are, becoming increasingly anti-free speech. I love being on there. Come join us, youngheretics.com/locals. Here is the mailbag question from American Valley. What is the role of the Hebrew tradition in the classics curriculum relative to Greece and Rome, and how do you see it personally? Larry Arnott Hillsdale speaks frequently of Athens and Jerusalem as the founding cities of the West, and the Old Testament is as important to our heritage as Homer and Virgil, but the general sense I have from even the sound academic tradition is that the Hebrew canon is not as essential as the Greek or Roman are. This is a really good question, and it actually speaks to me personally because I taught myself biblical Hebrew during my years as a PhD student in classics. When I say classics, what I mean is the study of ancient Greek and Latin literature, history, archaeology, all that stuff. But that is a sort of modernized approach. And as this questioner indicates, right, that's basically how we think of it now as these, the pagan traditions of antiquity, Greece and Rome, as central and foundational to our lives, to our philosophy, to our ideas, right? And then, but Hebrew isn't, the ancient Jews, ancient Israel is another ancient society. They coexisted in time, right, and in space often. So why don't we think of that as classics also? In some sense, this is like an ancient question and debate. I've mentioned before Tertullian's famous dictum, "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" The idea that there's this complete split, essentially. Once revelation comes and God reveals his truth in the Bible, then there's no need really for all the other stuff for these like blind pagans. I argue for something very different, which is that you can gain an integrated understanding of truth by seeing the scriptural traditions as fulfillments of all the truths that were discovered step by step among the great geniuses of Athens and of Rome. And that something like that idea used to be the kind of going version of classical education in America, especially, right? The Puritans, whom we've talked about before, brought over this religious model of centralizing, scripture and making Hebrew just as essential as Latin and Greek to the study of the ancient world. As religion became marginalized, Hebrew also became marginalized, and classics became secularized, became basically a discipline of historical and philosophical interest. And I found that my eyes were really opened, and other classical scholars have found this too. My eyes were really opened by learning even just any Semitic language. And those are, not just Hebrew, but Aramaic, and Arabic is a Semitic language. But especially learning Hebrew, of course, because it opens, all of these texts, which really should be viewed as, just as central, or if not more central, to our own society and life as the Greeks. And there are still people who will argue, in fact, that the Greeks and the Romans have nothing to teach us because we are a Christian society. I don't believe that. I think that Greeks and the Romans, discovered basically all that can be discovered at a humanist level, and that to know the sum of their thought is to know what it is that Christ redeems and what it is that he illuminates. But yeah, I think you should study. I think that a degree in classics should be all three languages and all three literatures. But it is not so anymore, in part because the university has sort of secularized, and this discipline of classics has secularized as well. Thank you for that question. I hope you go on to study all of those languages. And I will see you and anybody else that wants to join on Locals at youngheretics.com/locals. It's such a joy to talk about these great works with you. If you like this show, go ahead and hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. And check out the work that we do at the Claremont Institute, which is where I work. They are my employers. They very kindly allow me to pursue this massive passion project. But we study at the Claremont Institute the founding American ideals. We put out the Claremont Review of Books, which is a physical paper publication, and The American Mind, which is online. If you want to support the work we do, go to claremont.org/donate. Let them know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics, because that always makes us very happy to hear. And I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.